it was challenging to be a woman, and it was difficult to do some of the stuff I did, but I didn't really see like there was any other option to just keep plowing through and ignore what bothered me and keep going forward.
Welcome to Your Story Doesn't End Here, the mental health podcast for military and veterans. I'm your host, Rachel, and my mission with this podcast is to be a voice for those who don't have a voice, bring awareness to mental health issues, and provide value and solutions to help make life more abundant. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming back for another episode of Your Story Doesn't End Here. Today's guest is Amanda Huffman. She is an Air Force veteran and military spouse. She served in the Air Force for 6 years as a civil engineer before trading in her combat boots for a diaper bag when her first son was born. Today, she is the host of the Women in the Military podcast, freelance writer, speaker, and published author. Her new book, A Girl's Guide to Military Service, was released this September and was created to help inspire young women to consider a career in military service with the ground of truth of what serving in the military is like. She also is working to build a mentorship program to help connect girls looking to join the military with women who are serving or who have served in the military. You can sign up to be a mentor or a mentee in the link that I'm going to put in the show notes. And you can keep up with all the work Amanda is doing at her blog, www.airmantomom.com, which I will also put in the show notes. Amanda, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so I'd love to just hear a little bit more about you and your story and, where you got to or how you got to where you are today. And we'll just take it from there.
Yeah, so I joined the Air Force when I was in college. I was kind of lost and I didn't know what to do in my career, and I was bouncing around different places, and a bunch of my friends were looking into the military, either enlisting or someone I knew was getting activated to deploy. And then one of my friends was doing ROTC, and so he invited me to go to lunch with him and told me all about the ROTC program. And then I went to the open house they were having at the school a few weeks later and was like, okay, I'm going to try this out and see if it works. And I ended up loving the program and really felt like it was the right place for me. I switched my major to civil engineering, and that was kind of how I was introduced to the military and how I ended up joining. And I met my husband, and he commissioned a year before me, and then we were able to get a joint spouse assignment in New Mexico, and we both served on active duty for 6 years. I deployed to Afghanistan. He traveled all the time for work, and we were able to never move at the same time. He moved right pat when I was in Afghanistan, and then I came home and was able to PCS a few months after I got home and join him. But when my son was born and I got pregnant and I was thinking, like, I don't know if I want to do this military thing. I had a really long and hard deployment to Afghanistan. It was a year, almost a year. I think it was 361 days of like from when I left for training and when I got home from the deployment. And so it was a really long time to be gone. And at the time, the military deployed people or deployed moms after 6 months of their child being born. And I couldn't get past the idea of leaving behind a 6-month-old to do the same type of deployment that I had done. And so I decided if I didn't want to deploy and I was a civil engineer and they deployed all the time, it probably was a good idea to get out of the military. And my husband's still in the military. He's in the Space Force, and we're getting closer and closer to retirement. And so I had the challenge of getting out of the military and knowing that a year later we would be moving to a new place. And so it was really hard to do engineering knowing that like I would have to keep starting over. And I planned to be a stay-at-home mom, but I found I needed something else for me. And although I didn't want to focus on veterans, that was the story that resonated the most. And then once I started to pull on the thread of talking about deployments and then talking about women, I just got more and more passionate and more excited. And that's how I'm doing what I'm doing today.
Well, I love that. And I like that you bring multiple perspectives to the table, not just one perspective when it comes to military service. How was your experience in the military? I know you deployed to Afghanistan and you experienced obviously the officer side of things. Do you feel that you had a pretty positive experience overall, or do you think that there were quite a few challenges when you served?
I think overall I had a good experience. I had so many different opportunities that wouldn't have ever come my way had I stayed in the small town that I grew up in. And so the military really opened doors for me. I think that the world was really different. I know it wasn't very long ago, but I was in 2007 to 2013, and like sexual harassment was something that they talked about, but the advice was to just ignore when guys said stuff that was inappropriate or and I was lucky and never faced an assault or rape. And so in that way I was really lucky, and I also just took the advice of ignoring people. And so I don't think it's like hard to compare with like today. I hope they don't give the same advice, and I kind of know that like it's a different situation where it's almost more complicated because you have to figure out like how far do you want to take whatever thing is happening. And it wasn't a good thing that we ignored all the stuff that was happening, but it also made it a little bit easier to just focus on my job and not have to worry about that sort of thing. So it was challenging to be a woman, and it was difficult to do some of the stuff I did, but I didn't really see like there was any other option to just keep plowing through and ignore what bothered me and keep going forward.
So that's interesting. You said that the advice back then was just to ignore when it came to military sexual trauma. What
Not like rape and assault, just harassment. But I think that harassment is where like if you ignore harassment, then it opens the door, like then it kind of implies, yes, just ignore it all. But for me specifically, the advice was like if you're dealing with someone who's harassing you, just ignore it if you can. And then if it becomes a bigger problem, then bring it up. But if you can, at all costs, ignore it. And then if it becomes something that's like affecting your daily life, and I never got to a situation where it was, then you could report it. But it was kind of like not it wasn't it was kind of frowned upon in a way of like you're upsetting, you're rocking the boat, you're gonna cause all this paperwork. And so it really shows like why there's such a systemic problem within the military, because it goes back to like what as a young lieutenant I was told, like just ignore it, do your job. But we can't just ignore it because that's how it grows into bigger problems, and it can really affect people.
Yeah, it's interesting learning the history behind certain things in the military. And, I think sometime in the future, it'd be interesting to do more of a deep dive episode for people to really understand where things came from. But I think that a lot of it is hearing these stories and what people were told and like what was considered the norm, because people that served in your time are still serving today. And if that's what they were brought up with, then maybe they still think that's the norm. And so now I appreciate you sharing that tidbit of information. And so,
I should also add that I just was thinking about it, and I did I like to rock the boat. And I did in the ROTC unit I was in, I did report someone for something that he had done, where he had called out all the women, and I felt as the senior female in the unit that I should do something. So I reported him and I brought it up, and I did it more than once. And both times that it happened, it was swept under the rug, and they were like, "Oh, well, that person didn't really mean that thing. We'll go talk to him." And then the second person, they like coerced me to drop my charge because I actually had a valid claim for what had happened. And so that's probably why I was told, like, I don't think it ever, now that I think about it, was it ever told to me, like, to ignore it? Maybe not. But those two situations of when I was a cadet in college and speaking out against it, and the leadership protecting the people who are saying the things and doing the things, led me to say it's not even worth speaking up about it because nothing happens. And then you look like the bad person, and it just causes a lot of drama. So maybe it's not the advice that was given, but that was that's the why I believed what I believed when I was a lieutenant, because of the situation of the college experience of doing ROTC.
Yeah, and that's completely okay to feel the way that you felt at that time, to reflect back now and say, this is the environment that I was brought up in, and this is what made me feel safe at that time. I think a lot of women in the military feel that way when it comes to a lot of things. And, the culture's ever evolving, in some good ways, some bad ways. I don't think we're where we need to be yet, but, I think, learning from the past and learning from mistakes is where we really start to see that push for change in the right direction. So, yeah, I mean, I think what you experienced is probably a lot of the norm today, still, unfortunately. It's easier to ignore things than it is to rip that band-aid off and make the change. So as far as what you're doing now, because I know you do a lot of work with veterans, and I believe also some active as well. I know you have a book that just recently came out. You have your podcast that you do. Share with us a little bit about what your life looks like now and what you are doing for the veteran and military community.
So I'm gonna go back a little bit, and I deployed to Afghanistan, and I had trauma from my deployment, and so I went through a 9-step recovery process to deal with some of the anger and hurt and betrayal that happened on my deployment. And through that, in the ninth step, you get back to your community. And so my podcast was started as a way to like give back to the community, that I needed like some way to continue my mental health journey by helping people. And so the podcast was a way to help people by sharing the stories of women that are a group that enough people don't know about our stories. And so that was where like the podcast idea came from, and why there's so much passion in the podcast. It's not just like I run a podcast, but it's like, no, I run a podcast because I have a mission to tell the stories of women and to help make the military better for women in the future. And so that's why it started, and that's where the passion comes from.
I love that. How long have you been doing the podcast for now?
It'll be 4 years in December. Well, I guess January is the anniversary.
Okay, so you started the podcast long before podcasting was like a big thing to do.
Yeah, it was kind of in the like people knew about podcasting, but nobody was really doing it. And yeah, so it's been a while.
No, that's awesome. I love that. I think that women's stories are so important to share. My podcast obviously isn't niche to women only. I take all people's stories, military and veterans, but when we're talking about the women demographic, and this is something that I really love about your book, is that there's specific challenges that women face. There's specific triumphs that women experience too, and not enough people are talking about it. So to have a platform that really highlights that, I think is so important. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing. Wanted to talk a little bit about your book while we're on the subject. It's called A Girl's Guide to Military Service. I got my signed copy a few days ago. I love how you laid out everything. You didn't just talk about the upsides of the military, you talked about the challenges. Specifically, I love how you talk about the emotional side of things. You do address MST, and you really prepare women for what you could potentially face. And I talk about this all the time, is that I think if women were better equipped joining the military, that maybe their experience would be different. Understanding that what that recruiter's telling you about all the good things. Yes, there's great things to the military, but there are also challenges. So yeah, I'd love for you to just talk about how this book came into creation, what it really took to put it together, because obviously you talk about all the services in here. And yeah, just this is your moment to talk a little bit more about the book that you put out.
So I was trying to figure out a way to help women when they transition out of the military, because I had such a hard transition, and I was working with a coach on like how do you help people when you're setting up a business? And she was talking about, 'cause she was a blogger, and she said that she tries to help people as early in the process of blogging, which is, when you're going to start a blog, you want to help people then, and then you can help them with all the pitfalls and challenges that go along the way. So we were thinking about transition, and we were thinking, oh, 6 months before transition, and then we would go, or a year, and then eventually we got to the point where we realized like the best place to help people when they're transitioning out of the military is to give them a solid foundation when they're joining the military. So that's where the idea came from. And I thought it was a good idea, but I also was like, how am I going to find people who want this information? And so I made a lead magnet, a Girl's Guide to Military Service, a free resource. And I was like, okay, I'll make it. And then somehow I'll find, and I did. I found people, and they like would sign up, they'd email me, they would tell me like how impactful the podcast was and how hearing the stories of women and having a guide made for them, for women and not for men, and then like sort of for women too, was changing their experience of joining. And so I was like, well, this 5-10 page guide isn't enough. I need to do a book. And so I started writing the book, and I got pretty far along, and then I submitted my proposal to my publisher, Alvarisa, and they really liked it, but they also had a lot of suggestions on how to make it better. And so they really worked with me to not get so caught up in like the technicalities of joining the military, but the like high level information of what you need to know. And it's really meant to be like, I was in the Air Force, I was an officer, and like that was the best path for me. But I don't want to like push someone to say you should be in the Air Force and you should be an officer, because I don't think that my path is for everyone. It was for me, and it was the right choice for me. But picking a different branch, picking a different National Guard, active duty, reserves, whatever branch you want, officer, enlisted, enlisted to officer, like there's so many different combinations and so many different life experiences that you should know about everything, and no one should just tell you like this is what you need to do. And so that's why it's truly me trying to be unbiased as possible and to just share the information. And I would continually say, what do I wish I would have known when I joined the military, and then write that book. And I got so much great feedback from other men and women, veterans or service members, who would tell me what they would have known. Like I had my friend read the boot camp chapter, and she's like, "This is great, but like some people really struggle with physical fitness." And I was like, "Oh yeah," because I didn't struggle with physical fitness because I grew up running cross country, and so like the physical part was easy, but that's a real challenge for people. So I added a whole nother chapter of separating out both, because I was like too much in one, but the mental and the physical aspect of boot camp. And there's a chapter about finances, and one of the people that my husband worked with was talking about how the new blended retirement is so beneficial for women because not as many women serve until the 20-year retirement. And so how that can help make a foundation for your future, and you're not having to stay in for 20 years to get that retirement. And so that chapter is added just from that conversation. And so there were lots of like changes and additions and takeaways of all the different stuff to come up with the outline and the way it's laid out.
No, I love that. I think that your book is very, very beneficial to not only women that potentially want to join the military, but also women that are serving. I think being a better leader means that you're well-rounded enough to understand the entire process, not only from your own perspective, but understanding what other people might have gone through too, because a lot of these challenges that you talk about in your book are not just initial joining the service challenges. They're challenges that women are facing 10 years down the road into the military, their first year in the military. And so definitely a book that I think needs to be in the hands of every single service member, men and women alike, just to make them better leaders. So I will definitely make sure that there's a link in the show notes for anyone listening that wants to grab their copy of this book. Highly, highly recommend. It's just a good tool to add to your toolkit, as the military likes to always tell people. Amanda, your experience in Afghanistan shaped a lot of what you're doing and who you are today. Are you open to talking about that?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to just hear what it is that happened that drove so much of what you're doing today. I know you mentioned it with the podcast that you obviously had some therapy afterwards, that you had to really deal with some things that happened to you in Afghanistan. And then obviously, it's such a driving factor for your life today and almost created the person that you are. So what is it that happened to you that led to this chain of events to create who you are today?
Yeah, so I deployed, even though I was in the Air Force, I deployed with the Army, and I was attached to an infantry unit when women could not serve in infantry units. And so I was picked because of my career field, which was civil engineering, and the infantry unit was going out and they were the protection of all the people on the team who were doing the interaction with the local Afghan people. And so we were out running convoys and meeting with the local Afghan people. And so it was a really interesting experience, but there was a lot of infighting within the team, and there was a lot of dynamics of different people. Our commander got fired. He was not a good leader, and because of his lack of leadership, there was a lot of like people underneath him who were trying to like lead the team, and some of those people didn't like me and the other civil engineer who were there, and they spread rumors about us, and they tried to sabotage a lot of the work that we were doing. And so it was like you had to go on missions with people off base with the same people that when you were on base were like trying to sabotage you. And so that caused like a lot of mental strain. And my solution when I got home from my deployment was like, well, I'll just never think about those people again. And that's fine. It's in the past. I'll only think about like the good friends that I made and the experience that I had. And when I had my son, I was able to like kind of live that way for a few years. And then when I had my son and just the lack of sleep and my husband being gone for 2 months right after my son was born and all the different challenges, it brought that anger to the surface and I like couldn't control it and I didn't know where it was coming from or like what was happening to me. And so it took a lot of years to figure out like what was going on and to finally go and get help. And through that, I did the Celebrate Recovery program, which is like a group therapy. And then I've also done one-on-one sessions with Cohen Veterans Network. And then one of the tools that I'm still using today is meditation. It really helps me like ground myself and be able to like focus and to be able to ground myself. I like hate when people talk about meditation because they're like, it just works. And I'm like, but that's how I understand what they're talking about. It's like you can't really explain meditation until you do meditation because it seems really silly that you just sit there and like you focus on breathing, but it really does help my mental capacity, especially when I can feel like the emotions. I'm able to breathe and to calm down instead of like spin out of control. And so all that hard work has really like changed me as a person. But yeah, it was all some of it is because your childhood's not perfect. Some of it started in childhood, but then it like came to like high stakes being in a combat zone and getting shot at and all that other stuff that goes along with being deployed. And so yeah, so that was where it all came from. And that's why I think it's just so important that we talk about these things because I felt really alone when I left the military and I thought that I was the only one who was struggling the way that I was struggling. And then, you hear stories of other veterans and you're like, oh, I'm not the only one. I'm not crazy. Like, and that there's resources that can help you and so that you can get better.
Yeah, and I would love it if you would share those resources for me to put in the show notes for anyone else that wants to maybe take advantage of them. Meditation is something that I use too quite frequently. And, for me, I think it's just like having that moment where I don't have to do anything. Like all I'm worried about is me. And that's where I get my joy from meditation. It's like for a minute, I don't have to worry about house chores, taking care of my child. It's just like I don't have to think about anything, and it's nice. And so I get it. There are people that think that meditation is crazy and, a little woo woo, but I'm with you. I really love it. And, and it's something you can use anytime, any place. And so I'm so glad that you were able to find the help that you needed throughout everything that you went through. And I'm glad that you share your experience specifically, because I think that when people think about mental health specific things related to the military, a lot of times the conversation is centered around a lot of the same topics, right? Military sexual trauma, specific, like really, really horrible events. And I know you obviously went through combat, which is a whole other thing in itself. I talked to quite a few combat veterans who they really struggle with that combat piece way, way, way after serving. But when we talk about being in a sabotaging environment, being with bad leaders, like that alone can cause mental health trauma that can last way beyond the service. And it's kind of one of those things where, because like I dealt with bad leaders, right? But it's one of those things where you think like, yeah, I think I'm crazy for having issues because I had a bad leader, but it truly can, like it can be extremely, extremely damaging. But it's interesting that you bring up this piece where you had rage associated with it. I think a lot of people can relate to that. And it's just kind of one of those stories that, like, for me at least, makes me think, like, where else in my life am I experiencing something related to something else that I didn't realize was the thing because I thought that it was just me. So I really appreciate you sharing that part of your story. Where else can people find you? I know I'm going to put some things in the notes here, but where can people find you? Where can they support you and everything that you're doing?
My favorite place to hang out is LinkedIn. So if you go on LinkedIn, you can find me, and I try not to send too many posts. But I really like being active on LinkedIn, and I love the veteran community and the support that is within LinkedIn. I'm also on Twitter at Airman to Mom, and not really on Instagram, but I have an Instagram page, Airman to Mom, and then I'm on Facebook. And then I also have a Patreon account. So if people want to support financially through Patreon, it's a way to back influencers or podcasters through an app that gives you that opportunity. So that's a great way to go to Patreon/Women of the Military and to learn about what opportunities are there, and then to buy my book. Go out and buy my book and tell
You
people
should.
about my book.
Yeah, no, it's a really good book. I haven't finished reading it so far. I really kind of opened it up, went to a couple of the sections that I thought were very impactful related to me, the emotional section, the MST section, and I'm very impressed so far. So yes, go buy her book. I will have links in the show notes for everything. Amanda, I really appreciate you taking the time to be here, share a little bit about you, what you're doing for our incredible military and veteran community. And, I really, really look forward to seeing the work that is going to continue to being done within this community. But what you're doing is so incredibly important. And you're really doing such a huge service to this incredible community of military and veterans. So thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen in today. Each week, I'll be bringing you value in the mental health space and its direct impact on service members and veterans. If you feel you personally got value today from this episode, it would mean the world to me if you would leave a 5-star rating and review and share this to your audience. Until next time, remember, your story matters, your mental health matters, and your story doesn't end here.